Well, hello and welcome. This is video number 4 in an 11-part series on the French Revolution and Napoleon. Thanks for joining me today. In today's video, we're going to take a look at some of the early reforms made by the National Assembly that take place really in the first 2 years once we get to the beginning of the French Revolution and start moving forward. So here we go. All right, so I'm going to focus on really 3 things today as far as reforms made by the National Assembly in France. Not necessarily going to address everything, but just want to touch on a few major points. All right, so first of all, one of the early things that was done by this new National Assembly was to declare an end to the estates system. One of the things that particularly members of the Third Estate in France didn't like was that there were distinct differences and opportunities based on whichever estate you were in. And of course, for Third Estate people, they were on the outside looking in with virtually everything. And so one of the early acts of the National Assembly was to declare the First, Second, and Third Estates equal. This was done on August 4th, 1789, so very, very early in the process. Now, declaring the First, Second, and Third Estates equal probably felt more good than any practical change that might have taken place for people, at least in the short term, because you can say that everybody is the same, but you still know who's a part of the church. You still know who is a noble family. You still know who is, bourgeoisie versus sans-culotte versus peasant. It's not like people's financial situations changed overnight, or where they live changed overnight, or how they dressed changed overnight. But at least from probably mostly a symbolic point of view, the idea that the distinctions were gone felt good for a lot of people. Now, what it would actually mean moving forward, only time would tell. Right, another important, relatively early move by the National Assembly was to develop what came to be known as the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. In a lot of ways, it was a document pretty similar to the Declaration of Independence for our country. It pretty much tried to lay out the ideals of the National Assembly and the ideals that they had for France moving forward. And so when you read through it, what you'll see is a lot of language pretty consistent with Enlightenment ideas, talking about freedom, talking about equality, talking about democracy, those types of ideals. And as far as timeline, August 27th of 1789 is when this came out. So this is still very early in the process of revolution unfolding and changes beginning to take shape. One of the phrases that would be used throughout much of the revolutionary period comes from this document, the phrase liberty, equality, and fraternity, really trying to address those ideals of freedom and equality and brotherhood. And so, again, kind of like declaring the estates equal, what a statement of ideals like this would actually mean moving forward, again, only time would tell. It's one thing to talk about what you want to have happen. It's another thing for those things to actually occur. But if nothing else, whether you were a person within France or maybe somebody on the outside looking in, you were getting a better sense at this point of what this movement was about in France. Now, whether you supported it or not probably depended on who you were and what you had to gain, whether you happened to be in France or outside. But at least what the objectives were really beginning to take shape just in the first few weeks of this revolutionary movement. Now, moving ahead, once they got past kind of these statement of goals and ideals, then they really had to start getting down to the business of changing France and solving the problems of France, because they could get all excited about equality and fraternity and brotherhood, but that doesn't necessarily pay the bills. And one of the biggest issues facing France from a practical standpoint was the debt that France was in. And it didn't really matter whether France had a king or whether France was a republic or whatever it was. They owed what they owed. And the people of France had to go about trying to find a way to deal with these financial issues. And one of the things that would happen fairly early on, and this took place by July of 1990, so basically moving forward through about the next year or so, was to bring the church under the control of the state. Now, this ends up being a part of something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy, whereby the church was no longer its own independent entity as it had always been, but was actually just a piece of the French government itself. So, for example, if you were a church official like a priest, you were now a state employee, so to speak. You weren't just connected to the church itself, but you were a government worker in France. And then part of what that also meant was all of the resources that the church had, all of the land that the church held, any of the money or items of value that the church held in France, that was all now in the hands of the French government. Now, from a practical standpoint, this was objectively a way to gather some resources and make some payments that were needing to be made. But at the same time, you really had to take a step back and think, well, though practically this does give us some resources, is this going to be a positive thing moving forward? Is this going to lead to the kind of environment in France that's going to be beneficial to the greatest number of people? And again, like so many of these early changes, time would tell where this would go. But one thing that does really kind of develop pretty early on was some concern, surprisingly enough, out of the peasant class within France. Even though arguably they maybe had the most to gain from changes taking place in France, it was also out of the peasant class that you had some of the most devoted Christian followers. And so to see the church effectively be taken over by the state was pretty troubling to a lot of them. And many people, especially out of the peasant class, became somewhat soured to the revolution as it was beginning to unfold. And so as far as being able to maintain momentum, that was potentially going to be problematic. Now, the last thing I want to touch on in today's video is where the king was at in all of this as the first year or two are rolling by. And one thing that I think wouldn't be surprising at all is that the king and the royal family were concerned about these new developments taking place in France. I think to a large degree, they tried to kind of stay out of the way and not ruffle too many feathers and sort of see where this was going to go. But as time went by, a growing number of French nobles who were able to leave France were starting to do so just out of fear of where this was going to go and feeling like they might be at risk themselves, depending on how things went. And the king and his family began to feel that way as well. And one of the things about the king, he was married to Marie Antoinette, which had direct connections to Austria. And so the king and his family decided that it would be wise to leave France and head for Austria. Now, this ends up throwing an interesting twist into the process of revolution for France because the king and his family didn't make it out. They ended up being recognized as they were working towards the border and ended up, in essence, being detained and brought back to Paris. And the fact that the king and his family tried to escape and they were caught trying to leave France really fired up some of the most radical of the revolutionaries. So it's hard to say where things might have gone had the king and his family just continued to play ball, but especially seeing them attempt to escape gave fuel to the most radical-minded folks. Now, we'll be talking more about them in a future video, but for now, just know, getting to the middle and moving towards the end of 1791, the king has tried to flee, and the National Assembly still hasn't quite created a new constitution yet. They're still working on that. So this is a process that goes on for nearly 2 years, but they are getting ready to introduce a new constitution, and that'll be the subject of the next video. So thanks for watching. I hope that you're finding, or I found this video helpful and informative. Appreciate your time. Thanks for watching.